I pulled them from under that wagon, one in each arm, and wrapped my coat around both. The boy's skin felt like wax. The girl's breath came in shallow gasps that rattled in her chest. My horse, a gray gelding named Samuel, stood steady while I draped the children across his withers. The leather book stayed clamped in the girl's hand. I didn't try to take it. A man learns not to separate a child from the one thing she's holding on to. The ride back took an hour. Wind howled through the cottonwoods, making sounds like wolves, and I kept one hand on each child to keep them from sliding. The boy never made a sound. The girl whimpered once, a small animal noise that damn near broke me. I thought about my son. James had been 7 when the scarlet fever took him. 5 years gone now, but I still heard his laugh sometimes when the house settled at night. By the time I reached the ranch, both children had stopped shivering. That scared me worse than the shivering had. Esther. As I kicked the door open, not caring about the snow I tracked across her clean floor. Esther, I need you now. She came from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. A woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled tight. She took one look at the children, and every soft line in her face went hard. Moses, she shouted toward the barn. Stoke that fire hot as you can get it. As Moses Freeman came through the door 30 seconds later, a black man tall as a doorframe, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or break a man's jaw, depending on what was needed. He'd been my foreman for 10 years, ever since he mustered out of the Union Army, with a bad leg and no place to go. He saw the children, and his face went still. Lord have mercy. Strip them, Esther said, already pulling the girl's frozen dress over her head. Get every wet thing off. Moses, I need stones from the fire, wrapped in cloth, and warm milk with honey. I held the boy, while Moses worked the buttons on his shirt. The fabric had frozen to his skin in places. Underneath I saw bruises, old ones yellow and fading, and newer ones purple-black across his ribs. These ain't from the cold, Moses said quietly. Esther wrapped the girl in a wool blanket and started rubbing her hands and feet. The girl's fingers were white at the tips, frostbite setting in. Esther worked bear grease into them, the same grease she'd used on my son's chest when he'd had the croup. My hands remembered that motion. Rubbing in circles, praying under my breath. The boy started crying then, not making any sound, just tears running down his face while he stared at nothing. I pulled him against my chest and felt how small he was, how his heart beat like a rabbit's. You're safe now, I told him. Nobody's gonna hurt you here. Moses brought the warm milk. We got half a cup into the girl before she opened her eyes, dark as creek water, too old for her age. Where's Mama? She whispered. I didn't know what to tell her. Esther took my place, cradling the girl's head against her shoulder. Your Mama and Papa are with the Lord now, child, Esther said, voice soft as I'd ever heard it. But you're here with us and you're going to be just fine. The girl's face crumpled. She tried to pull away, reaching for something, and I realized she was looking for that leather book. I'd set it on the table when we came in. It's right here, I said, bringing it to her. Nobody's taking it. She clutched it to her chest, tears streaming now, but she didn't make a sound, just held that book and shook. The boy had fallen asleep against me, or maybe passed out. I couldn't tell which. His breathing was steady now, and some color had come back to his lips. They'll need watching through the night, Esther said. If that frostbite turns bad, we could lose fingers. I'll watch, I said. Moses picked up the boy, gentle as holding a newborn calf, and carried him to the bedroom that had been my son's. Esther followed with the girl. I sat by the fire and looked at that leather book on the table. It was old, the cover cracked and stained. When I opened it, I saw columns of numbers and what looked like recipes. Measurements for flour and sugar, butter and salt. But something about it felt wrong, like the numbers didn't quite line up with the words. Moses came back, saw me studying it, and leaned over my shoulder. That ain't no ordinary book, boss, he said. Before I could answer, the girl's voice came from the bedroom, small and terrified. Papa said, keep it safe. He said it's the only proof. 3 days passed before the children could talk without shaking. The girl's name was Sophie, her brother was Thomas. Their parents had been Daniel and Catherine Pritchard, and they'd been running from something when they died. Sophie wouldn't say what. Every time I asked, she'd go quiet and hold that book tighter. On the 4th day, I took them into Cutter's Bend to see Doc Harrison. The town sat in a valley where 3 creeks met, a cluster of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped there by accident and decided to stay. The main street was all mud and horse shit, lined with a bank, a general store, a saloon, and the doctor's office above the barber shop. Doc Harrison was 70 if he was a day, with hands that trembled until they touched a patient. Then they went steady as stone. He examined Thomas first, listening to his chest, checking his extremities. When he lifted the boy's shirt, he went very still. Mr. Cole, he said quietly, could you step outside with me for a moment? We stood on the landing, cold air seeping through the boards. Below us, townspeople went about their business, women with shopping baskets, Men leading horses to the livery. I saw Mrs. Fletcher from the general store watching us, and knew by supper time the whole town would know I'd brought two strange children to the doctor. Those marks on the boy's back, Doc Harrison said. They're not from any wagon crash. I know. Someone's been disciplining him with a strap. Regular like, from the look of it. Some of those bruises are weeks old. My hands clenched into fists. You know who? Can't say for certain, but if their parents are dead and the children are this afraid, I'd wager whoever did it is still looking for them. When we went back inside, Sophie was sitting on the examination table, watching the door like a cornered animal. Doc Harrison smiled at her, gentle as he could. Your brother's going to be just fine, young lady. And so are you. Lost a bit of that little finger to frostbite, but you'll keep the rest. And she looked at her bandaged hand and nodded. Sophie, I said, kneeling so I was eye level with her. Who's uncle? Her whole body went rigid. It's all right, Doc Harrison said. Mr. Cole here won't let anyone hurt you, but we need to know who we're watching for. Uncle Vernon, she whispered. He runs the bank. He told Mama and Papa he needed their papers signed, but Papa said no. Papa said Uncle Vernon was stealing from orphan accounts. Her voice dropped even lower. That's when Uncle Vernon locked us in the cold room. The cold room? The vault? At the bank? He locked us in overnight because we wouldn't stop crying. Said if we told anyone, he'd do worse. Doc Harrison's face went pale. Vernon Pritchard did that? Sophie nodded. I knew the name. Vernon Pritchard managed the Cutter's Ben Bank and Trust, a thin man with wire spectacles and hands that never got dirty. He'd tried to loan me money once for a cattle expansion. Something about the way he'd smiled when I'd refused had made my skin crawl. Doc, I said, standing. Not a word of this to anyone. Not yet. Yeah, Matthias, if what she's saying is true, then we need time to figure out how to prove it. A man who runs the bank has friends. He'll have papers, legal standing. All I've got is two frightened children and a story that sounds crazy. Doc Harrison looked at Sophie, then at me. Finally, he nodded. We left through the back stairs, avoiding the main street, but we weren't fast enough. A buggy pulled up just as we reached my wagon. A matched pair of black horses, polished brass fittings, and behind the reins sat Vernon Pritchard himself. He climbed down slow, adjusting his coat, his spectacles catching the winter sun. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. Matthias Cole, he said, voice smooth as rendered fat. Heard you'd found some lost children out on Bitter Creek Road. Sophie grabbed my hand so hard I felt her nails through my glove. Found them, yes, I said. Their parents didn't make it. Tragic. Vernon shook his head, the picture of sorrow. Daniel was my brother-in-law, you know. Catherine was my dear sister. And these precious children, he took a step towards Sophie, are my responsibility now. Thomas made a sound like a wounded animal and buried his face against Esther's skirt. They seem comfortable where they are, I said. Vernon's smile thinned. I'm sure they do. You've always been generous, Cole, but blood is blood, and the law is quite clear. I have guardianship papers already drawn up, dated 2 weeks ago, before this terrible accident occurred. Convenient timing. Prudent timing. Daniel knew he was ill. He asked me to take care of the children if anything happened. Vernon pulled a folded document from his coat. Everything legal and proper. I didn't take the papers. Children just lost their parents? Seems cruel to uproot them again so soon. I understand. Vernon tucked the papers away. Tell you what, keep them for a week. Let them recover. I'm a reasonable man after all. He paused, studying my face. In fact, I'd be willing to compensate you for your trouble. Say $500? That's more than fair for a week's boarding. $500. A year's wages for some men. I don't need your money, I said. Something flickered behind Vernon's spectacles, not anger, calculation. Of course not. You're a man of means. He climbed back into his buggy, gathering the reins. I'll return in a week with the marshal, just to make everything official, you understand. Territorial law is quite clear about these matters. Bloodkin trumps charitable strangers no matter how well-meaning. He tipped his hat and drove away, buggy wheels cutting clean lines through the mud. Moses had been watching from beside the wagon. Now he stepped close, voice low. Boss, them boot prints by the wagon where you found the children? What about them? They match the tracks that buggy just left. That night, Sophie woke screaming. I was out of bed before I knew I was moving, my hand finding the rifle by the door. But it wasn't wolves or men at the window, just a little girl sitting up in the darkness, her voice raw with terror. Esther got to her first, gathering her close and making soft sounds that weren't quite words. Thomas sat up in the other bed, eyes wide and glassy. The cold room, Sophie sobbed. He locked us in the cold room, and Mama couldn't find us, and Papa was bleeding, and... Hush now, Esther murmured. You're not in any cold room. You're here, where it's warm, and nobody's going to lock you anywhere. I lit a lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. The light caught on Sophie's face, tracks of tears gleaming on her cheeks. She looked at me like she was trying to decide if I was real. Your uncle? I said quietly. Tell me about the cold room. Sophie swallowed hard, her hands twisted in the blanket. Papa went to the bank to get papers. Our papers. Mama said they were important, that they proved something about land. But Uncle Vernon said Papa had to sign other papers first, papers that said Uncle Vernon could manage our money until we were grown. And your father refused. As Papa said the numbers were wrong. Said Uncle Vernon had been taking money that wasn't his. Uncle Vernon got very quiet, and then he smiled and said perhaps the children would like to see where the bank kept its valuables. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He took us to the vault, told us to go inside and look. Then he closed the door. How long? Esther asked, her face tight. All night. It was so cold. Thomas couldn't stop shaking, and I tried to keep him warm, but there wasn't anything warm in there. Just metal and dark, and she stopped, breathing hard. In the morning, Uncle Vernon opened the door and said if we ever told anyone, he'd lock us in there forever. He said Mama and Papa had signed the papers after all. I looked at Thomas. The boy hadn't said a word since I'd found him, but his eyes were fixed on his sister, and in them I saw something break. Papa didn't sign, Sophie said. I know he didn't. That's why he took us and ran. That's why... She couldn't finish. Didn't need to. I stood, went to the table, and brought back the leather book. This what your father was after? These papers? Sophie nodded, taking it from me with careful hands. Papa said to keep it safe. He said if anything happened, this would prove Uncle Vernon was stealing. I'd spent the last 3 days studying that book when I couldn't sleep. The recipes made no sense. 3 cups of flour for a cake that called for 1 egg, a pound of sugar, but no butter, and the names beside each entry, Widow Harrison, the Dalton orphans, Emily Chen, your mother, I said slowly. She kept the bank's books? Before she married Papa, Uncle Vernon kept her on to do the accounting. She was good with numbers. Moses had been standing in the doorway, listening. Now he stepped into the room, his shadow long across the floor. A cipher, he said. Recipe book's a cover. Real accounting's hidden in the measurements. Esther looked at him, then at the book, then at me. You saying Catherine Pritchard hid evidence of theft in a cookbook? I'm saying a woman who kept bank records would know how to make records disappear, and how to keep a copy somewhere safe. Moses took the book, handling it gentle. I learned to read in the army. Had a sergeant who taught us codes, ways to send messages the Rebs couldn't understand even if they caught the couriers. This feels like that. Sophie was watching him with something like hope in her eyes. Can you read it? Can you prove Papa was telling the truth? Not tonight, Moses said. But give me time, and I'll make sense of it. I looked at the children, Sophie with her bandaged hand and 2 old eyes, Thomas silent and broken, both of them carrying bruises that weren't all from the cold. Then I thought about Vernon Pritchard in his fine buggy, smiling while he offered me money, $500 to forget. Come with me, I said to Sophie. You too, Thomas. I led them through the house to the back room where I kept my tools. The branding iron hung on the wall, the letters MC worked into the metal, my initials, the mark I'd put on every calf born on my land for 20 years. You know what this is? I asked Sophie. She nodded. I took it down, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Every creature that carries this mark belongs to me. That's the law out here. You mark what's yours, and no man can claim it's his, not without proof stronger than your mark. I went to my workbench and found 2 strips of good leather, soft enough to wear, but thick enough to hold a brand. I worked the leather with oil until it was supple, then cut 2 cuffs, one sized for Sophie's wrist and one for Thomas's. Moses, I said, fire up the forge. 20 minutes later, the branding iron glowed red in the darkness of the forge. I laid the first leather cuff on the anvil and pressed the iron against it. The smell of burning leather filled the air, sharp and acrid. When I lifted the iron, the letters MC stood out clear and permanent. I did the same with the second cuff, then let them cool before I brought them back to the children. This is a promise, I said, fastening the first cuff around Sophie's wrist. The brand sat just above her pulse. You wear my mark, you're under my protection. Nobody takes you without going through me first. I put the second cuff on Thomas. The boy looked down at it, then up at me, and for the first time since I'd found him, something flickered behind his eyes. Does this mean we're yours now? Sophie asked, her voice small. I thought about my son, about the empty room I'd kept closed for 5 years, about the way grief could turn a house into a tomb if you let it. Yes, I said. It means you're mine. Sophie touched the brand on her cuff, running her fingers over the raised letters. Then she looked at Esther, at Moses, at me. Uncle Vernon won't care about a brand, she said. He has the law. Moses spoke from the doorway, his voice quiet but certain. Law's just words on paper, little one. Sometimes a man's word matters more. But even as he said it, I saw the doubt in his eyes. Brand or no brand, Vernon Pritchard had guardianship papers. He had the bank, the town's credit, and territorial law on his side. All I had was a promise burned into leather and 2 children who'd already learned that promises could be broken. February came, and cold and mean. I spent the days working cattle with Moses while Esther taught the children how to live again, simple things, like setting a table, gathering eggs, kneading bread dough. Thomas still didn't speak, but he'd started following me around like a shadow, watching everything I did with those serious eyes. Sophie learned fast. Too fast, like a child who'd had to grow up before her time. She could curry a horse, mend a fence rail, and by the end of the second week, she was helping Moses with the evening feeding. The leather cuffs never left their wrists. Then the notes started coming. First was from the general store. Credit denied until certain matters regarding guardianship were resolved. Then the feed supplier, the blacksmith, even the church sent word that perhaps it would be best if I didn't attend services while hosting the Pritchard children. Vernon was tightening the noose without ever showing his hand. On the last day of February, Moses came back from town with news that made my blood run cold. 8 ranches had received foreclosure notices from the bank, not for missed payments. Every one of them was current. But Vernon had found clauses in their loan agreements, technicalities that let him call the notes due immediately. Henderson, McKay, Chen, Hollis, all families you rode with during the fence war, Moses said. He's cutting you off from your allies, boss, making sure nobody'll stand with you when he comes for those children. And that night, while Sophie and Thomas slept, I found Esther in the kitchen. She was working dough with more force than it needed, her mouth set in a thin line. He's going to take them, she said without looking up. That banker's going to walk in here with the law behind him, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. Language, Esther. Don't you language me, Matthias Cole. I've been in this territory 30 years, and I know how it works. Man with money and papers beats a man with neither every single time. I couldn't argue with her. She was right. Moses thinks he's close to cracking that cipher, I said. If we can prove Vernon's been stealing, maybe. Esther slammed the dough onto the counter. Meanwhile, winter's ending. Roads will be clear in 6 weeks. That's when he'll come. When there's no excuse of weather, no reason to delay. She was right about that, too. 3 weeks later, I had to move 100 head of cattle to winter pasture up north, a 4-day ride in good weather. Moses would come with me. We needed 2 men for that many head, and the ranch hands had all quit after the credit got cut off. I don't like leaving you here alone, I told Esther the night before we left. I'm not alone. I've got the children and a loaded rifle. She paused. You really think he'll try something while you're gone? I think he's been waiting for exactly this. I was right. We'd been gone 2 days when Moses' horse threw a shoe. We had to backtrack 8 miles to a settlement with a farrier, and that's when I saw the notice on the trading post wall. Temporary guardianship granted to Vernon Pritchard. Children to be transferred to his custody, effective March 15th, by order of Marshal Tibbs, Territorial Court. March 15th was tomorrow. Boss, Moses said quietly, we're 40 miles from home. I was already saddling my horse. We rode through the night, pushing the horses harder than we should have. Dawn was breaking when we finally topped the ridge overlooking my ranch. The marshal's wagon was already there. I spurred my horse down the slope, Moses right behind me. By the time we reached the yard, Marshal Tibbs was on the porch, papers in hand. Vernon stood beside him, perfectly composed in his city clothes. And on the porch steps, Sophie and Thomas stood with their hands bound. Not chained, not yet. But Vernon had brought leather straps, and both children's wrists were tied in front of them. Matthias, Marshal Tibbs said, and had the decency to look uncomfortable. Got a court order here. Legal guardianship passes to Mr. Pritchard effective immediately. I dismounted, my legs unsteady from 2 days in the saddle. Where's Esther? Inside, Tibbs said. Wouldn't let us take the children until I showed her the papers. She's not pleased. Sophie was staring at me, her eyes huge in her pale face. The leather cuff with my brand sat just above the strap binding her wrist. This ain't right, I said to Tibbs. These children are terrified of him. Children fear discipline, Vernon said smoothly. It's natural. They'll adjust once they're back in a proper home. Proper home? You locked them in a bank vault? Vernon's expression didn't change. I don't know what stories they've been telling you, Mr. Cole, but children have vivid imaginations, especially after trauma. He gestured to the wagon. Come along, children. We have a long drive back to town. Sophie didn't move. Thomas pressed against his sister, shaking. I'm their blood relative, Vernon said to me, all pretense of friendliness gone. I have legal papers, signed by a territorial judge. You have nothing but sentiment. He took a step toward the children. Sophie, Thomas, Get in the wagon, now. No. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the morning air like a knife. Vernon's face darkened. Excuse me? She held up her bound wrist, showing the leather cuff with my brand. We're his. The brand says so. The brand, Vernon said with a thin smile, is meaningless. You're not livestock, child. You're my wards. In territorial law. Law says bloodkin, I interrupted. But it also says rancher's law. Anything that carries a man's brand is his responsibility under frontier custom. Been that way since before Wyoming was even a territory. That's for cattle, Vernon snapped. The law doesn't specify cattle, just says marked property under protective custody. And I was making it up as I went, hoping it sounded official enough to give Tibbs pause. These children carry my mark. That makes them mine, until a judge says different. Marshal Tibbs looked at the papers in his hand, then at the children, then at me. Matthias, I don't think— 3 days, I said. Give me 3 days to file a counterclaim with the territorial court in Cheyenne. If the judge rules against me, I'll bring them to Vernon myself. Vernon's hand went to his coat pocket, and I saw something flash there. Maybe a gun, maybe just keys. His voice dropped low and cold. You're making a mistake, Cole. I have friends, I have resources, and I have the law. He turned to Tibbs. Marshal, I demand you enforce this order immediately. Tibbs shifted his weight, uncomfortable. 3 days won't hurt nothing, Vernon. Let the man have his hearing. Then you're refusing to uphold a legal writ? I'm exercising discretion. Cole's been a good citizen. These kids look well cared for. I don't see the harm in letting a judge sort it out proper-like. Vernon stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was worse than his anger had been. Very well. 3 days. He climbed into his buggy, gathering the reins. But understand this, Cole. When I come back, I'll have more than just papers. I'll have consequences. For you, for your ranch, and for anyone who stands with you. He drove away, leaving deep ruts in the mud. Tibbs untied the children's wrists, shaking his head. I hope you know what you're doing, Matthias. Vernon Pritchard's not a man to cross. Neither am I said. After Tibbs left, I found Moses in the barn. He was sitting on a hay bale, the leather-bound book open in his lap, and when he looked up, his face was grim. Boss, he said, I cracked the cipher. And? $12,000. Stolen from 15 orphan accounts over 3 years. Names, dates, amounts. Catherine Pritchard documented everything. He closed the book carefully. This proves Vernon's been embezzling, proves he had motive to silence Daniel and Catherine, proves everything. Then we take it to the judge in Cheyenne. There's more. Moses's voice went even quieter. One of the entries mentions a land patent, Sophie and Thomas's inheritance. Their mama's family owned 640 acres upstream, water rights, worth $15,000, easy. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That's what he's really after. That's what he killed for. Moses stood, tucking the book inside his coat. And he's got 6 weeks before bank examiners from Denver arrive for the annual audit. He needs those kids' land sold, and the money moved before then, or he hangs. On the porch, Sophie stood watching the road where Vernon's buggy had disappeared. When I came out, she turned to me. He's not going to wait 3 days, she said. He's going to come back tonight. I looked at the leather cuff on her wrist, at the brand I'd burned there. A promise. Let him come, I said. But what I didn't say, what I couldn't say, was that all the brands in the world wouldn't matter if I couldn't prove Vernon's crimes before he took these children back. And buried the evidence, 6 feet under. Vernon didn't come that night. Or the next. What came instead was worse. On the second morning, riders arrived at dawn, not Vernon's men, but neighbors. 8 of them, faces I'd known for years. Henderson, with his gray beard. McKay still young enough to think himself invincible, chin with worry lines carved deep around his eyes. They gathered in my yard, hats in hands, and wouldn't meet my gaze. Henderson spoke first. Matthias, we need to talk. I'd been mucking stalls with Moses. I set down my pitchfork and wiped my hands on my pants. Speak your piece. Bank called our notes. All of them. Said we got 30 days to pay in full or we lose everything. Henderson's voice cracked. That's 8 ranches, Matthias. 43 people, counting wives and children. Vernon told us straight. He'll forgive the technical violations if we don't stand with you when he comes for those kids. The words hit like a fist to the gut. He's buying your silence, Moses said flatly. He's buying our survival, McKay shot back. I got 3 daughters under 10. You want me to tell them we're homeless because I took a stand on principle? So you came here to what? I asked. Tell me you're abandoning us. We came to ask you to think, Chen said quietly. Those children, they're not yours, not by blood, not by law. Vernon has papers, he has the right. And if you fight him, He'll destroy everyone around you until there's nothing left. And as Sophie had come out onto the porch, she stood there in one of Esther's old dresses cut down to fit, the leather cuff visible on her wrist. She didn't say anything, just watched the men with those two old eyes. I gave my word, I said. Your word won't feed our families, Henderson said. Won't keep roofs over our heads. He put his hat back on. I'm sorry, Matthias, we all are, but we can't help you, not this time. They left, one by one, until only their hoofprints remained in the mud. Moses spat in the dirt. Cowards. They're scared, I said. Can't fault a man for protecting his family. Can fault him for not standing against evil when he sees it. That afternoon, I rode into town alone. The main street was busier than usual. March thaw had brought people out, ready for spring after a hard winter. I tied my horse outside the general store and went inside. Mrs. Fletcher looked up from her counter, saw me, and her face went carefully blank. Need supplies, I said. Flour, sugar, salt pork, the usual. Can't help you, Mr. Cole. I have cash money. I know you do. But Mr. Pritchard made it clear, anyone who does business with you while you're harboring his wards will find their own credit cut off. She at least had the grace to look ashamed. I'm sorry, I truly am. I walked out without another word, tried the feed store, the blacksmith, even the church. Every door closed in my face, polite but firm. Vernon had turned the whole town against me in 48 hours. I found Pastor Weeks on the church steps, repairing a loose board. He was a man in his 50s, thin as a rail, with hands calloused from carpentry and a face that had seen too much suffering to judge others lightly. Matthias, he said, not looking up from his work. Pastor, I heard about the children, about Vernon's claim, and he set down his hammer, and I've been praying on it. Vernon Pritchard is one of my congregants. So are you. So were Daniel and Catherine Pritchard before they died. He finally met my eyes. Daniel came to me 2 months ago, told me he'd discovered theft at the bank, asked me to hold something for him in case anything happened. My heart started beating faster. What kind of something? Documents, financial records. Pastor Weeks wiped his hands on his pants. I didn't understand them then. Still don't, not fully. But Daniel said if anything happened to him and Catherine, it was to make sure those papers reached someone who could read them properly. You still have them? Hidden in the church cellar, behind the winter stores. He picked up his hammer again. Vernon Pritchard announced on Sunday that he's planning a land auction. April 28th. Selling 640 acres of unclaimed inheritance property to fund his ward's care and education. That son of a... Language, Matthias. We're on church steps. I bit back the rest of the curse. He's selling the children's land, their inheritance. So it would seem. And if those documents Daniel left prove what I think they prove, Vernon needs that land sold and the money moved before anyone looks too closely at his books. Pastor Weeks stood, brushing sawdust from his knees. Judge Pierce is due for spring circuit on May 1st, 3 days after Vernon's auction. Convenient timing. Isn't it, though? The pastor looked toward the bank, visible down the street. I'll get you those documents tonight. Bring Moses. He's the only man I know who can read well enough to make sense of financial records. Well, why now? I asked. Why not before? Because before, I thought the law would handle it. Thought Marshal Tibbs or the territorial court would see justice done. He met my eyes again. But I watched 8 good men ride out to your ranch this morning. Watched them choose their land over their conscience. And I realized sometimes the law needs help. Sometimes it needs witnesses willing to stand up when it's dangerous to do so. That evening, Moses and I met Pastor Weeks in the church cellar. He pulled aside a crate of preserved vegetables and removed a loose stone from the wall. Behind it was an oilcloth packet, carefully wrapped. Inside were bank ledgers. Not a cipher this time. The real books, the ones Vernon kept hidden. And tucked between the pages, a hand-drawn map showing water rights, property lines, and 640 acres marked Pritchard Estate, Catherine's maternal inheritance. Moses spread the documents on a barrel top and studied them by lantern light. His finger traced columns of numbers, cross-referencing entries, and the longer he read, the darker his expression became. 15 orphan accounts, he said finally. $12,000 missing, replaced with false entries. And here, he tapped a notation in Vernon's handwriting. March payment due to Denver. If he doesn't cover the embezzlement before the June audit, the bank examiners will find it. So he needs the children's land, I said. Needs it sold, needs the money, and needs Sophie and Thomas under his control so they can't contest the sale. Moses looked up. Boss, this proves everything. Embezzlement, motive, the works. We take this to Judge Pierce, who won't be here for 5 more weeks, Pastor Weeks interrupted. And Vernon's auction is in 4. The lantern flickered, casting shadows across the stolen ledgers. Somewhere above us, the church bell began to ring, 7 o'clock, calling the faithful to evening prayer. Then we stopped the auction, I said. Moses gave me a long look. How? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as we left the church, I saw smoke rising from the bank chimney, Vernon's office window glowing with lamplight. He was working late, probably moving money, covering tracks, preparing for the auction that would bury his crimes forever. And I thought about Sophie's face when she'd held up her branded wrist. We're his. The brand says so. A promise burned into leather. I'd made that promise without knowing what it would cost. Now I was starting to understand. It might cost everything. The question was whether I had the courage to pay it. The fire came 3 nights later. I woke to the smell of smoke and Moses shouting. By the time I got my boots on and made it outside, the bunkhouse fence was already burning, flames licking 20 feet into the night sky. The children! Esther screamed from the doorway. They're with me, I yelled back. Sophie and Thomas stood on the porch in their nightclothes, faces orange in the firelight. I had moved them to the main house, after Vernon's threat, kept them close. Moses was already throwing buckets of water, but the fire was spreading fast. Too fast. This was an accident. Someone had doused the fence rails with kerosene. Then I saw them. 3 riders on the ridge, silhouetted against the stars. They sat there for a long moment, making sure we saw them, before they wheeled their horses and disappeared into the darkness. It took 2 hours to kill the fire. When the smoke finally cleared, a quarter of the fence was gone, reduced to charred posts and ash. In the mud beside the water trough, I found a glove. Fine leather, monogrammed with the initials VP. He's not even trying to hide it anymore, Moses said, picking up the glove. Wants you to know he can reach you anytime he wants. I looked at the burned fence, at my house where 2 children slept, at the darkness beyond my property line where Vernon's men had sat and watched. Get some sleep, I told Moses. Tomorrow we finish what we started. But Moses was already kneeling in the mud, studying something. Boss, come look at this. Boot prints, fresh ones, leading from the burned fence toward the road. And next to them, wagon tracks. Deep ruts, like someone had been hauling something heavy. These are the same prints from Bitter Creek Road, Moses said quietly. Same pattern, same depth, same wagon that was at the scene where you found the children. The world went very still. Vernon was there, I said. The night the children's parents died. More than that. Moses pointed to where the tracks overlapped. Look at the spacing. This wagon came to the fence, stopping, and someone got out. Then it left fast. You can see where the wheels skidded. He didn't just hire men to burn my fence. He came himself. Man's getting desperate, Moses said, making mistakes. We followed the tracks to the road, but they disappeared into the general traffic of the main route. Still, we had the glove. And now we had proof Vernon had been at both sites, the wagon crash and my ranch. The next morning I rode back to town, but this time I didn't go to the general store or the church. I went to a small house on the edge of Cutter's Bend where the seamstress, Mrs. Chen, lived with her husband. She opened the door cautiously, saw me, and started to close it again. Please, I said. Just 5 minutes. My husband told you we can't help. I know, and I'm not asking you to stand against Vernon publicly. I pulled the leather book from my coat, but your husband said Catherine Pritchard was good with numbers, that she kept books before she married. Mrs. Chen's eyes fixed on the book. Where did you get that? Sophie had it when I found her. Won't let it out of her sight. I held it out. Moses cracked part of the cipher, but he thinks we're missing something. A key, maybe. Something only someone who knew Catherine would recognize. She hesitated, then took the book. Her fingers traced the cover, and her eyes filled with tears. Catherine made this, she said softly. I watched her bind it. She said it was for recipes. We used to trade recipes, the women in town. But I always wondered. She opened it, studying the columns. These measurements are wrong. All wrong. Oh, that's the cipher. Moses figured out each recipe represents a bank account. The measurements are the real amount stolen. Mrs. Chen flipped through pages, her expression sharpening. Then she went to her kitchen and came back with her own recipe book, a simple notebook with flour-dusted pages. Catherine gave me this 5 years ago, said if I ever needed to bake her special Christmas cake, the recipe was in here. She opened it to a marked page. But I never understood it. 4 cups of flour, that's twice what any cake needs. Moses had come with me. Now he leaned over her shoulder, comparing the 2 books. His eyes went wide. It's the key, he said. The measurements in her book are the baseline. You subtract them from the amounts in the coded ledger, and what's left is the stolen amount. Mrs. Chen looked at me, then at Moses, then back at the book in her hands. Catherine knew. She knew Vernon was stealing, and she hid the evidence where no one would look. And when Vernon found out she knew, he killed her for it, I said. Mrs. Chin sat down hard, like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. My husband can't know I helped you. Vernon will call his note. We'll lose everything. I understand. But, she looked up at me, jaw set, Catherine was my friend. And if you can prove Vernon murdered her, if you can make sure those children get justice. She pulled a sheet of paper from her kitchen drawer and began writing. This is the cipher key, every recipe Catherine used, with the correct measurements. You cross-reference it with that ledger. You'll have exact amounts for every dollar Vernon stole. She finished writing and pressed the paper into my hands. There's one more thing. Catherine told me once, about 3 months before she died, that she'd hidden something important, something Vernon could never find. She said it was in the place where hearts are kept. What does that mean? I don't know, but she touched her locket when she said it. Chen walked to her door, opened it. You should go, before someone sees you here. Moses and I left, but as we rode away, I saw her watching from the window. One woman, risking everything she had to help prove a truth everyone else was too afraid to speak. That afternoon, Esther called me to the children's room. Sophie was sitting on her bed, and in her hands was her mother's silver locket, the one she'd been wearing the day I found her. She wants to show you something, Esther said. Sophie opened the locket. Inside, where most women kept a curl of hair or a small portrait, was something else entirely. A piece of paper, folded so small it was barely visible. And on that paper, written in tiny, precise handwriting, was a land patent, 640 acres. Water rights, registered to Catherine Ann Morrison, transferred upon her death to her legal heirs, Sophie Morrison Pritchard and Thomas James Pritchard, worth $15,000. The place where hearts are kept, I said softly. Sophie nodded. Mama told me never to take it off, said if anything happened to her, this paper would prove who we really are. Moses took the patent carefully, unfolding it by lamplight. This is legal, properly registered, properly transferred. Vernon can't sell this land. He's not the owner. The children are. Unless he has them declared legally incompetent, Esther said, or gets himself appointed permanent guardian with power over their estate, which is exactly what he's trying to do, I said. The auction's in 3 weeks. He's betting no one will challenge him before then. Sophie looked at me with those dark, serious eyes. Will you? Challenge him? I thought about the burned fence, the closed doors in town, the 8 families who'd turned their backs because they were afraid. I thought about Vernon Pritchard sitting in his bank office, moving money and hiding evidence, confident that fear and law would protect him. Then I looked at the leather cuff on Sophie's wrist, at my brand burned into it. A promise. Yes, I said. I will. Moses folded the land patent and tucked it carefully into his shirt. Then we'd better move fast, because Vernon's not going to wait much longer. That night, riders came again. Not to burn anything this time, just to watch. They sat on the ridge for an hour, dark shapes against the stars, before finally riding away. The message was clear. We're coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. But what Vernon didn't know was that we'd found his weakness. We had the embezzlement records, the cipher key, and the land patent. We had proof. The question was whether proof would be enough when the man we were accusing controlled every purse string and legal lever in the territory. April came with cold rain that turned the roads to soup. I spent 3 days trying to figure out how to fight a man who owned the law and came up empty every time. On the 4th day, I saddled my horse with the intention of riding to Vernon's bank and settling things the old way, with my fists or worse. I was loading my rifle when Moses stopped me in the barn. Boss, he said quietly, don't. He burned my fence, threatened my home, terrorized 2 children who've already lost everything. My hands were shaking with rage. I'm done waiting for justice. You shoot him, you lose those kids forever. Law'll hang you, and Sophie and Thomas will go right back into Vernon's custody. That what you want? I wanted to say no, wanted to be the better man. But all I could see was Sophie's face when those riders had circled the house, the way Thomas had hidden under his bed and wouldn't come out for 6 hours. Then what do I do? The words came out broken. Tell me, Moses, because I'm out of answers. Moses took the rifle from my hands and set it aside. You trust the law. The law's on his side. Some of it, maybe, but not all of it. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. Judge Pierce is in Laramie right now, 3 days' ride south. I can reach him before he starts his circuit north. Show him the evidence, the ledgers, the cipher key, the land patent. Everything. Vernon's auction is in 3 weeks. Even if the judge believes us, Judge Pierce is old-school territorial, rode with the Rangers before he took the bench. He doesn't love bankers, and he doesn't love men who hurt children. Moses folded the paper and tucked it away. Give me 5 days. I'll bring him back and we'll settle this legal. And I looked at him, this man who'd stood with me for 10 years, who'd never asked for anything but fair wages and honest work, who was offering now to ride 60 miles through spring mud to save 2 children who weren't his. Why? I asked. Why do you care this much? Moses was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. I was born a slave, boss. Learned to read in the army because I wanted to understand the laws that freed me. But I also learned that laws are just words. They don't mean nothing unless people are willing to stand up and make them mean something. And he looked toward the house where Sophie and Thomas were helping Esther with breakfast. Those kids are slaves right now, slaves to Vernon's money and papers and fear. I can read the law that says he owns them, but I can also read the law that says he's a thief and a murderer. Question is, which law matters more? I gripped his shoulder. 5 days. But if Vernon makes a move before then you do what you have to do, but give the law a chance first, for their sake. He gestured to the children. Moses left before noon, the evidence tucked in oilskin pouches inside his saddlebags. I watched him ride south until he was just a speck against the gray sky. That afternoon, riders came again. Not Vernon's hired men this time, townspeople. 40 of them, gathering in my yard with the kind of quiet that comes before storms. Pastor Weeks spoke first. We heard Moses rode out, heard he's gone to fetch Judge Pierce. News travels fast. Vernon knows too, he's planning something. The pastor shifted his weight. There's talk in town about moving the auction up, about taking the children before the judge arrives. Let him try. Matthias. This was Henderson, the rancher who'd told me 3 weeks ago he couldn't help. We were wrong, all of us. We chose our land over what's right, and we've been living with that shame ever since. So you came to tell me you're sorry? We came to tell you we're standing with you. McKay stepped forward, young and earnest. Vernon called our notes to isolate you, but he can't foreclose on 40 families at once. We talked it over, all 8 ranches. We're done being afraid. Mrs. Chen pushed through the crowd. The women too. We've been organizing. If Vernon tries to take those children before Judge Pierce arrives, he'll have to go through every mother in this town. And I looked at them, these people who'd turned their backs on me a month ago, now standing in my yard, offering help they couldn't afford to give. Some of them had tears on their faces. All of them looked scared but determined. He'll ruin you, I said. Every single one of you. He might, Pastor Weeks agreed, but we'll be ruined with clean consciences. That's worth something. Esther came out onto the porch, Sophie and Thomas beside her. The children stared at the crowd, not quite believing what they were seeing. How many people? Sophie whispered. 40, maybe more, Esther said. Whole town's here, near enough. For us? For what's right, child. Sometimes that's the same thing. I turned back to the crowd. Vernon won't take this lightly. He'll fight dirty, use every lever he has. We know, Henderson said, but we also know this. If we let him take those children, if we let him get away with murder because we're too afraid to stand up, then we're no better than he is. And this town deserves better. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. All right then, as I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been tight since the day I'd found those children frozen on Bitter Creek Road. Moses will be back in 5 days with Judge Pierce. Until then, we stand together. Vernon wants those kids. He'll have to come through all of us. The crowd began to disperse, but they didn't go far. Some set up camps in my pasture. Others rode home and came back with supplies, food, blankets, ammunition. By nightfall, my ranch looked like a small settlement. Sophie watched from the porch as families set up tents and built cooking fires. They're staying? Looks like it. Because of us? I knelt beside her. Because of you. Because sometimes people need to see courage before they can find their own. You've been brave since the day I found you. Now they're being brave too. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Moses riding through the dark, about Vernon plotting in his bank office, about all the ways this could go wrong. Around midnight, I heard someone on the porch. It was Thomas. The boy hadn't spoken a word in 6 weeks, but now he stood beside me, looking out at the campfires dotting my land. He reached out and took my hand. Didn't say anything. Didn't have to. We stood there together, watching 40 families stand guard through the night, and I understood what Moses had meant about laws being just words until people make them mean something. These people were making them mean something now. The question was whether it would be enough when Vernon came calling. Vernon didn't wait 5 days. On the morning of April 27th, the day before his scheduled auction, church bells started ringing. Not the measured toll for services, frantic, urgent clanging that meant only one thing: fire. I was saddling my horse when Pastor Weeks came riding hard into the yard, his face pale. The courthouse. Someone torched it last night. All the county records, gone. My stomach dropped. The land patents. Every deed, every title, every birth and death certificate for 3 counties. All ash. He dismounted, breathing hard. Vernon's claiming it was an accident. Knocked lantern. But the fire started in the records room, Matthias. Right where the land patents were kept. The children's inheritance. Gone. No legal proof they own that 640 acres. Pastor Weeks gripped my arm. He's moving the auction up. Today, noon. Says without county records to contradict him, his guardianship papers are all the proof he needs to sell their land. Esther appeared in the doorway. Moses isn't back yet. I know. Judge Pierce won't be here for 3 more days. I know that too. She looked at me hard. So what are you going to do? I thought about the land patent hidden in Sophie's locket, about the ledgers proving Vernon's theft, about 40 families camped on my land who'd chosen courage over safety. I'm going to that auction, I said, and I'm bringing everyone with me. By 11 o'clock, we'd formed a convoy. 43 people on horseback and in wagons, with Sophie and Thomas riding beside me. The children wore their best clothes, hand-me-downs from Esther, but clean and pressed. The leather cuffs with my brand sat visible on their wrists. The town square was packed when we arrived. Vernon had brought in an auctioneer from Cheyenne, a man with a voice like rolling thunder and no ties to local sympathies. A platform had been erected in front of the bank, and Vernon stood there in his finest suit, looking every inch the respectable guardian. Marshal Tibbs was there too, standing to one side with his hand resting on his gun belt. When Vernon saw us coming, 40 riders, 40 witnesses, 2 children with brands on their wrists, his smile faltered. Just for a second. Then it was back, smooth as oil. "Matthias," he called out, "how kind of you to bring my wards." I was just about to send the marshal to collect them. "Auction doesn't start for an hour," I said, dismounting. "We've got time." "For what?" "For the truth." The crowd in the square had gone quiet. 100 people, maybe more, all watching to see what would happen. I helped Sophie down from her horse. She was trembling, but when I looked at her, she nodded. "Tell them," I said quietly. "Tell them what happened." Sophie walked to the platform steps. Her voice, when she spoke, was small but steady. "My name is Sophie Morrison Pritchard. This is my brother, Thomas. Our parents were Daniel and Catherine Pritchard. They died on Bitter Creek Road in January, and Mr. Cole found us." She held up her wrist, showing the leather cuff. "He gave us his brand, his promise, said we were under his protection." "Very touching," Vernon said. "But the law says you're our guardian," Sophie continued, louder now. "But it doesn't say you can steal from us, doesn't say you can lock us in bank vaults, doesn't say you can kill our parents." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Vernon's face went white, then red. "That is a vicious lie." "Is it?" I pulled the leather ledger from my coat. "This is your wife's sister's book. Catherine Pritchard kept the bank's records before she married. She knew you were stealing from orphan accounts. Knew you'd taken $12,000 over 3 years. That's absurd. That book is coded." Moses' voice cut through the square like a knife. The crowd parted. Moses sat on his horse at the edge of the square, and beside him rode a man in his 70s, with a silver star on his coat and eyes that had seen every kind of evil men could devise. Judge Harlan Pierce. "We decoded it," Moses continued, dismounting. "Every recipe is an account, every measurement is a stolen amount, and we have the cipher key, thanks to Mrs. Chen." The judge climbed down from his horse, moving slow but steady. He took the ledger from my hands and studied it. "Bank of Cutter's Bend records," he said, "coded to look like recipes. Clever." He looked at Vernon. "I've seen this kind of thing before. Embezzlers always think they're the first to try it." "Your Honor," Vernon said, his voice tight, "this is highly irregular. The auction is postponed." Judge Pierce's voice carried across the square. "By my authority as circuit judge, I'm opening an immediate investigation into allegations of embezzlement and fraud at the Cutter's Bend Bank and Trust." Vernon's face was the color of old paper. "You can't." "I can. I did. Marshal Tibbs, secure the bank. No one goes in or out until I've reviewed the books." Tibbs moved to comply, but Vernon stepped in front of him. "The county records burned. There's no proof those children own anything. Without proof, I have every legal right to sell unclaimed property to cover their care." Sophie pulled the locket from around her neck. Her hands were steady as she opened it and removed the tiny folded paper inside. "Mama said to keep this safe," she said, handing it to the judge. "Said it proved who we are." Judge Pierce unfolded the land patent. Read it once, then again. When he looked up, his eyes were hard as flint. "Catherine Ann Morrison, 640 acres with water rights, transferred to her legal heirs upon her death." He turned to Vernon. "You told the court these children had no documented inheritance. You lied under oath." "I didn't know about that," Vernon said quickly. "The mother must have hidden The mother documented your theft and hid proof of her children's inheritance where you'd never find it, because she knew what you were, what you are. The judge's voice dropped low and cold. And when you found out she knew, you killed her for it. That's a lie. Vernon's composure finally cracked. The wagon accident was no accident, Moses said. He pulled something from his saddlebag and held it up. A metal pin, the kind that held wagon wheels to their axles. Found this in your desk when Marshal Tibbs executed the search warrant. It's got Daniel Pritchard's initials carved in it. You removed it from their wagon wheel. Made it look like mechanical failure. The crowd erupted. Shouts of anger, women crying, men surging forward. Vernon reached for something inside his coat. I saw metal flash. A derringer, small but deadly at close range. Stay back, he screamed, swinging the gun toward Sophie. All of you stay back, or I'll... Sophie didn't freeze. Didn't scream. She stepped between Vernon and the judge, her chin raised, and said 5 words that cut through the chaos. You already killed Mama and Papa. Her voice was steady, certain. You won't kill Mr. Cole too, because everyone here sees you now. Everyone knows what you are. Vernon's hand trembled. The gun wavered. Put it down, Vernon, Judge Pierce said quietly. It's over. For a long moment, nobody moved. The whole square held its breath. Then Vernon's shoulders sagged. The gun dropped from his fingers and clattered on the platform. I needed the money, he whispered. The gambling debts. The Denver investors. His voice broke. I didn't mean for them to die. I just wanted them to sign the papers. But they wouldn't, and the auditors were coming, and I... Confessing? Judge Pierce said. Vernon looked up, seemed to realize what he'd just said, and his face went gray. Marshal, the judge said. Take him. Tibbs stepped forward, pulling out shackles. As he fastened them around Vernon's wrists, the banker looked at Sophie with something like wonder. You're just a child, he said. How did you... I'm not just a child, Sophie said. I'm Sophie Morrison Pritchard. I own 640 acres and I carry Matthias Cole's brand. She held up her wrist, showing the MC burned into leather. That means I'm protected. That means I'm family, and family doesn't give up. Vernon was led away through a crowd that parted in silence. Some people spat at him as he passed. Others just watched. Witnesses to the fall of a man who'd thought money and fear could protect him forever. Judge Pierce turned to me. Mr. Cole, I'm granting you temporary guardianship until we can sort out the estate. Those children clearly trust you, and God knows they've earned the right to choose their own family. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet. There's paperwork, lots of it, and questions about how you came by some of this evidence. He almost smiled, but I suspect we'll find everything was obtained legally, more or less. He handed me back the ledger and the land patent. Keep these safe. They're evidence now. And Mr. Cole, that brand on their wrists? Clever. Unconventional, but under territorial rancher law, it might actually constitute a legal claim. We'll see what the lawyers say. As the judge walked away to examine the bank records, the crowd began to disperse, but not before. One by one, they came to shake my hand. Henderson, McKay, Mrs. Chen and her husband, Pastor Weeks, 40 families who'd stood when it mattered. Sophie and Thomas stood beside me, solemn and quiet. Is it over? Sophie finally asked. Yes, I said. It's over. She looked at her brother. Something passed between them, some silent communication only siblings share. Then Thomas, who hadn't spoken in 3 months, said his first words. Can we go home now? His voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper. But it was there. Yes, I said, my own voice breaking. Let's go home. The legal proceedings took 3 weeks. Judge Pierce worked through Vernon's books with the kind of methodical fury only a territorial judge could muster. Every stolen dollar, every forged entry, every lie built on lies. All of it documented and entered into the record. Vernon Pritchard was sentenced to 15 years hard labor at the territorial prison in Laramie. The embezzled funds were recovered and returned to their rightful owners. 15 orphan accounts. Made whole again, Sophie and Thomas's inheritance was secured. 640 acres with water rights, held in trust until they came of age. Judge Pierce appointed me as legal guardian and trustee, with Esther and Moses as co-signers to ensure everything stayed proper. Unusual arrangement, the judge said as he signed the final papers. But then, branding children with your ranch mark is unusual too. Seems to have worked out. The 8 foreclosed ranches got their notes forgiven. Turned out Vernon had called them illegally, and the Territorial Banking Commission nullified everyone. Henderson, McKay, Chen, and the others got to keep their land. Got to keep their dignity too, having stood up when it counted. Spring came in earnest. The burned fence got rebuilt, this time with help from 20 neighbors who showed up with timber and nails and wouldn't take no for an answer. The bunkhouse got a fresh coat of paint. Moses planted a kitchen garden behind the house. teaching Sophie and Thomas the difference between vegetables and weeds. On a warm afternoon in early May, I took the children up to the ridge overlooking the ranch. You could see for miles from up there, the creek running silver through the valley, the cattle scattered across green pasture, the mountains still white-capped in the distance. "This is all ours now?" Sophie asked, taking it in. "Your land's upstream," I said. "But yes, part of this view belongs to you." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Do we have to leave when we're grown?" "Leave? When we don't need a guardian anymore. When we're old enough to manage our own property." She looked up at me, worry creasing her forehead. "Will you send us away?" I knelt so we were eye level. "Sophie, Thomas, listen to me. Listen to me. That brand on your wrists isn't temporary. It's not something that wears off when you turn 18. It's a promise. You're mine, and I'm yours. And that doesn't change just because some judge says you're old enough to sign papers." So we can stay?" Thomas asked, his voice stronger now than it had been a month ago. "You can stay forever if you want. This is your home. I'm your family." I touched the leather cuffs they still wore. "Blood doesn't make family. Choice does. And I chose you the day I pulled you out from under that wagon." Sophie threw her arms around my neck and held on tight. Thomas joined her, and for a long moment we just sat there on the ridge, three people who'd found each other in the worst way possible, and somehow become something better for it. That evening, Esther made a feast: roasted chicken, fresh bread, early vegetables from the garden. Moses brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving, and we toasted to new beginnings. "To justice," Pastor Weeks said, raising his glass. He'd ridden out to join us, along with a dozen other townspeople who'd become regular visitors. "To courage," Mrs. Chen added. "To family," Esther said, looking at Sophie and Thomas. "However we find it." We drank and talked and ate until the sun went down. The children fell asleep at the table, exhausted by happiness in a way they'd never been by fear. I carried them to bed one at a time. Sophie stirred when I tucked her in. "Papa," she murmured, half asleep. My throat tightened. "I'm here." "Mama would like you," she whispered. "She'd say you did good." "Go to sleep, sweetheart." She was already drifting off, one hand curled around her locket, the other resting on her branded cuff. Later, I sat on the porch with Moses. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. "You did a good thing," Moses said. "We did a good thing? Couldn't have done it without you." "Maybe." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think? I think those children saved you as much as you saved them. You've been living like a ghost for 5 years. Ever since you lost your boy. Now you're living again." He was right. I hadn't realized how dead I'd been inside until Sophie and Thomas brought me back to life. "Reckon a man's family isn't always born to him," I said. "Sometimes it walks it through a blizzard and finds him, or falls out of the sky in a wagon crash." That too. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the darkness. Somewhere in the house, I heard Thomas laugh in his sleep, the first time I'd heard that sound. It was a good sound, a sound worth fighting for. The leather ledger sat on the table beside me. Tomorrow I'd take it to the county clerk's office, have it properly archived as evidence. But tonight, it was just a reminder that truth matters, that courage matters, that standing up when it's hard matters more than staying safe when it's easy. Inside, 2 children slept under my roof, wearing my brand, carrying my name in all but law. The law would catch up eventually. Judge Pierce had already started the adoption paperwork, but the law didn't matter as much as the promise. The promise burned into leather, spoken on a winter night when 2 frozen children needed someone to believe in. I'd kept that promise, and I'd keep it for the rest of my life. "You going to sit out here all night?" Esther asked from the doorway. "Maybe." Well, when you come in, there's pie. Sophie helped make it." She smiled, used one of Catherine's recipes. "The real ones, not the coated ones." "How is it?" "Sweet as spring," Esther said. "Sweet as second chances." She went back inside, leaving me alone, with the stars, and the darkness and the quiet sound of family sleeping safe behind me. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of new grass and warm earth. Winter was truly over. Spring had come at last, and this time I wasn't facing it alone. 20 years gone now, since that winter. I'm sitting on this same porch, older and grayer, watching my grandchildren play in the yard where Sophie and Thomas once learned to live again. Sophie runs the ranch these days, her and her husband. She's got her mother's head for numbers and her father's steady hands. The leather cuff still sits on her wrist, worn smooth by 2 decades but still showing the MC brand clear as the day I burned it. Thomas surveyed the land upstream, the 640 acres that nearly cost him everything. He mapped every creek, every boundary line, every inch of the inheritance his parents died protecting. He's got children of his own now, and he's teaching them the same thing I taught him, that land matters, but family matters more. The leather ledger's in a museum over in Cheyenne. Evidence of how one woman's courage brought down a corrupt man, and how a community found its spine when children needed them most. People come from all over to see it, to read about the Cutter's Bend case and the rancher who branded orphans to save them. They always ask the same question: why did you do it? And I always give the same answer: because a man's family isn't always born to him. Sometimes it comes through a blizzard, broken and frozen, and clutching a book full of secrets. Sometimes it asks one simple question: will you fight for us? And the answer changes everything. Moses passed 3 winters back. Peacefully in his sleep, Esther followed him a year later. They're buried on the ridge, where they can watch over the valley they helped save. Me, I'm still here, still watching, still remembering the day I found 2 children who weren't mine, and chose to make them mine anyway. The brand says MC, mine to care for. Always has, always will. That's what family means.